Welcome everybody to a China Currents webinar. We appreciate you coming. What we're going to discuss today is sort of the situation surrounding China now that the Party Congress has come and gone and the U.S. election has come and gone. And we're going to do it from basically three different points of view, and we have three distinguished panelists with us. Let me introduce them first. We have Yawei Liu, who is the senior advisor on China for the Carter Center here in Atlanta. We have Dr. Andy Wedeman, professor of political science at Georgia State University. Thanks for coming, Yawei and Andy. And Dr. John Givens, who's associate professor of international studies at Spelman College. And the way we've divided this up is that we've asked Yawei to talk about, Dr. Liu to talk about U.S. China relations, and Dr. Wedeman to talk about internal politics in China, and Dr. Givens to talk about Taiwan as it relates to China and the U.S. So I want to start with let me throw out a broad question, one after the other. Let me start with Yawei, and just want to ask you to assess U.S.-China relations right now. And is it possible that U.S.-China relations have already hit rock bottom and are maybe slightly on the upswing? So if you could take it away, we'll go from there.
Thanks, Jim, for the introduction. And looks like, do I look like a little fuzzy there? Yes, I think U.S.-China relationship probably has hit the bottom, at least before the summit that happened in Bali, Indonesia. Looks now, to me, it is in a slight upswing. As we speak, I think Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific, Daniel Crittenbrink, Laura Rosenberg from the National Security Council, and also Rick Waters, they were all in China preparing for the visit by Secretary Antony Blinken. And of course, after the summit, there's also the meeting between President Xi Jinping and Vice President of the United States. There's also the meeting between Secretary of Defense of the US and also his counterpart in China. I think China's messaging is very clear. As I wrote in my commentary that I sent to you last night, that messaging began with the visit by Foreign Minister Wang Yi in late September when he attended the General Assembly of the United Nations. To make it short, I think one thing I want to highlight is probably the majority of the Chinese leaders are now convinced that U.S. has engaged not only in a strategic rivalry with China, but will do everything at any cost to contain the rise of China. But they still want to see if these decision makers in Washington, D.C. can be persuaded to change their mentality and their mind. So what I see is, from the messages from Foreign Minister Wang Yi to the political report, to the meetings between the two presidents in Bali and all the other meetings, is the China side seems to give another opportunity to the United States, to change its mind and decision, not to decouple, but to find a way for the two countries to compete, responsibly, if we can quote President Biden. So hopefully, the U.S. side will approach China more carefully this time, not to trample on the red line that John Givens is going to talk about, so that at least for 2023, the two countries can look into the possibility of stabilizing the relationship so that they can figure out, how this competition is going to be managed in a way that it doesn't veer into conflict. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks very much. That's a really good overview, and we're going to come back to this thing. You mentioned leadership, which sort of is a natural segue to Dr. Wedeman to talk about China's internal politics. And I want to start with this, Andy. Do you think is Xi Jinping in as strong a position now as it seems sort of from the outside, at least from the casual observer?
Well, I mean, he was in a pretty strong position prior to the 20th Party Congress. He's been in power for 10 years. He has used the anti-corruption campaign to cleanse the top ranks of both people who are potential political rivals, but also those who are less than filial to the central leadership. And so coming into it, going into the 20th Party Congress, I was not particularly overwhelmed by this as a great sea change. Essentially, we saw a kind of orderly generational transition where the old guys from the Jiang Zemin era have now largely exited. Most of the Hu Jintao era people were gone. It certainly was somewhat of a surprise that she completely eliminated people who are linked to Hu Jintao. And of course, this was most dramatically illustrated by the events surrounding Hu Jintao and his apparent desire to read the list of who was on the Politburo and the desire of others to have him not read the list of who was on the Politburo. But, in some ways, I mean, coming out of it, to me, it was kind of a ho-hum. We knew he was going to go for a third term. I was pretty sure he was going to pack the Politburo. I thought he would leave, Hu Chunhua in as perhaps the premier, as a kind of a sop to Hu Jintao and an element of continuity. So that was a surprise. But when I first wrote my commentary about 2 weeks ago, I thought, well, Xi Jinping is strong enough that he's simply going to stay the course. Well, some things happened. And of course, what happened was we had the anti-COVID protests, which in and of themselves, I think got greatly hyped. They weren't very large. They were dramatic in that they had people chanting anti-regime slogans. But what was dramatic was the response and the fact that the regime very quickly began to dismantle key elements, particularly the unpopular elements of COVID zero. Now, it wasn't completely a surprise. They had been making some noises prior to the Congress that they were going to, begin to relax things. But I think what's surprising is how abruptly they did it. And it doesn't appear that they have any plan. They're just dismantling it. And so I think in some ways, the big question right now is what's going to happen in the next few weeks. Protesters were we assume were very happy to see the end of COVID. But if you look what's coming out of China, there's a huge segment of the population that is absolutely panicked. I've seen reports out of Beijing of empty streets, empty restaurants, no medicine in the pharmacies, and people just terrified that China is going to be where we were back in the spring of 2020, with a wave of infections, a wave of deaths, et cetera. And so in some ways, Xi Jinping now, I think, rather unexpectedly faces considerable more challenges coming out of the Congress than I would have expected. I mean, he had some that he was going to face anyway. He's got the slowing economy. He's got the problem of the trade war with the United States, the relationship with the United States, all of which are contributing to this economic and social malaise where, as I write in my commentary, Xi can't go out like his predecessors and say to the Chinese people, use the famous Ronald Reagan question, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, and get a rousing yes. He faces now, despite having consolidated so much power in the party, is going out on the rostrum of Tiananmen Gate and saying, asking the question, having it come back as no, I don't think so. And I think the future looks bleak. And I think in some ways, this to me suggests Xi Jinping is actually, as he enters his third term, he's probably in a more precarious position than he was either in his first or second.
I want to come back to this question of the about face on the COVID policy. That's a very large subject. But before we do that, I want to move on to Dr. Givens. John, let's switch focus to Taiwan. Do you think it's possible? Is it possible for the status quo to be maintained and just things to go on as they are? Is that at all possible, or is that a pipe dream?
I think really the only variable left undetermined in my paper with this is what Xi Jinping thinks about it, what he will allow, because from the perspective of Taiwan, I don't think there's a good alternative to the status quo. From the perspective of the United States and most of the rest of the global economy, I don't think there's a good alternative to the status quo. And so I think this really just leaves the question of whether China will tolerate the status quo, and I think that's mostly a question of Xi Jinping. Although I think we always need to be careful, and Andy, this is really more his topic, but it comes up here, is Xi Jinping is obviously very powerful. He's, I think, unquestionably the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. He's consolidated power. There aren't a lot of other challenges to his power within the Politburo or the Chinese top leadership, but there is also China's military, right? And that there are generals in there, and we're not really party to those kinds of interactions, right? There may be more pressure from that camp than we know. But with that one, still important caveat, I really think the question is, does Xi Jinping, and I lay out the three options in the paper, Xi Jinping could either feel threatened in some way, his regime is being threatened by these protests, or probably not these protests, but some bigger version of these protests or some future protests, or by maybe if there's a huge wave of COVID deaths, or the economy slows, or some combination of these things, is probably most likely. If he really feels his regime is threatened, then he might turn to a diversionary crisis with Taiwan, even an invasion, in order to distract, in order to win support, in order to make use of the rally around the flag syndrome. And this is something we've seen. There's a whole very well-established political science literature on this, on leaders who are threatened, turning sometimes called gambling for resurrection, turning to usually a foreign policy issue where they can bank on nationalism. So this is the one scenario, probably the most dangerous. Well, maybe not the most dangerous, but one scenario where Xi Jinping invades Taiwan, or at least starts pushing really hard on that, making the status quo impossible. And the second is the much slower version of that, which is more similar to, I think, what we've seen with Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, which is he feels he has a legacy to create, right? He's the first leader in a generation in China that's going to stay past his 10 years. What does he have to show for it, right? And the longer this goes on, maybe the more he feels he needs something specific to show for it. And so I think that's a threat as well. So I think the status quo is actually pretty solid right now, because the alternatives are so bleak on kind of every side. Because Taiwan independence doesn't seem realistic, at least not a peaceful version. So yeah, that's where I would say that ends up with Taiwan.
Let me follow up with on this point with Yawei, and just ask if the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping are preparing or trying to sort of woo the United States and to, as you say, give the U.S. another chance to establish a better bilateral relationship. Don't they have to kind of essentially lay off of Taiwan for at least a while? And how long do you think that they're prepared to wait?
Thanks, Jim, for that question. I think my sense is, if U.S. is not going to use Taiwan as an issue to contain China, the Chinese leadership is not going to be too adventurous in doing anything to Taiwan. If you look at what happened since President Trump, moved into the White House, even though the U.S. government blamed the Chinese government for crossing the median line, or scrambling too many fighter jets and getting warships too close to Taiwan. But each and every time, almost without exception, China side is reacting either to a visit such as Speaker Pelosi's visit, or to a sales of arms to Taiwan, or something that happened on the island itself. So if U.S. side, for example, if Kevin McCarthy, if he was elected the speaker, he goes to Taiwan again, then China side certainly will once again react to that. There is another round of arms sale from the U.S. in the new defense authorization bill. I think there's a total of more than 400 million, a lot of arms that will be provided to Taiwan free of charge. If Congress, the new Congress, is going to adopt the Taiwan Policy Act, China is going to react. But if U.S. side is more constrained, I think certainly we can expect China side to be more constrained too.
Okay. We've got a question in the chat, which I want to.
Jim, can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
I
Andy,
mean, the one thing in this regard that impressed me is something that John alludes to in his paper is the DPP got quote unquote thrashed in local elections, which throws an interesting spanner into the works that, if the U.S. or if China suspects that the U.S. is drifting toward some sort of change in the relationship with Taiwan, and heretofore has seen support for unification slipping and support for independence increasing, this says maybe the Taiwanese voters are like, okay, we need to go back from the brink. And if they go back from the brink, does that take the pressure off the White House to respond to Taiwan's supporters in the Congress and allow it greater room and allow Xi Jinping to say, okay, well, the danger is actually decreasing. And who cares if they sell them arms, as long as Washington makes clear, as Biden did, that we still believe in the one China policy. And if I think as John alludes to, and we've talked about this before, Xi Jinping may well be worried about his legacy, and being the man who recovered Taiwan would be great. But as I said the last time around, the worst thing would be the man who lost Taiwan to get into a risky diversionary war that, given a wave of COVID deaths, would look like a diversionary war and have it not succeed. In that case, then I think Xi Jinping might well want to start looking for real estate somewhere outside of China, because he's going to be politically crippled if he gets into the scenario of a diversionary war that fails.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Appreciate that. I want to go to a question we've gotten in the chat here, which is this: if U.S.-China relations are to be reset, does the U.S. need to back off of some of the restrictions on chip access, which is a serious challenge to China's economy and to Chinese companies? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, let me quickly respond to that. I don't think U.S. side is going to back away from, because that's a law passed by Congress and signed by President Biden. No, U.S. side is not going to reduce that effort to decouple from China on the high-tech side, particularly on technologies with dual use, the military side. I think there are many other things the USA can do to at least to lower the temperature of the relationship. But at the same time, China side will also have to do something, has to address the concerns of the US, one by one. I hope the meeting that took place in Langfang, the day before yesterday in Beijing, I wonder why the meeting was held in Langfang. Maybe the cases of COVID in Beijing is like so big, they want to have the meeting outside Beijing. And the upcoming meeting between Chinese leaders and Secretary Blinken are going to be serious, not just a rather rhetorical exercise, but designed in such a way these meetings are going to address, what U.S. can do and will do, and how China will address concerns expressed by the U.S. And hopefully, we're going to see serious exercise of how they want to cooperate, and what exactly are the mechanisms so that the relationship can be managed responsibly and peacefully.
Okay, let me just sort of follow up on that with maybe Andy, you should chime in on this one. We talked about the pressures on Xi Jinping right now and the reversal of the COVID policy. I mean, they've just turned on a dime overnight, and we've all been reading about how they're using the press to say, well, we're turning the corner on COVID and everything's going to be okay. Would you assess what those pressure points and to what extent that, Xi Jinping has got a lot of power. He can do what he wants. He can use the media the way he wants. It's just all going to work. I mean, if there is a major sort of outbreak and a lot of deaths, can they successfully cover it up?
First of all, I think it's important to understand is Xi Jinping has a lot of power in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai, but the COVID policies are actually being run at the local level. And where a lot of the problems have cropped up is at the neighborhood level. And Xi Jinping cannot reach out and run all of those neighborhoods. Those are people who are responding to a complex set of incentives, mostly which is you've got to keep the number of cases low. And so a lot of the things that that people were protesting about are not actually regime policy. They are local implementation of rather vague policies. And I think for Xi Jinping, the problem is that, they have the power to kind of turn on and turn off, but they don't really control the process. So I think if you look at what's going on it's very ad hoc. There doesn't seem to be any kind of uniformity. A lot of stuff goes on at the provincial level or the sub-provincial level. And his problem is, he sits atop basically a kind of chaos. And how much can he control it? You can keep things out of the press, but the thing is in China, a lot of ordinary people, Chinese don't believe the press. They believe the rumor mill. And the worst thing to happen would be for the regime to cover up what people could see. I mean, if people are seeing the ambulances, if they're seeing the kind of scenes we saw back in, April and May of 2000 with, refrigerator trucks lined up outside of hospitals, at the end of the day, you can't cover that up. And you can't cover up the fact that people are beginning to lose friends, relatives, and colleagues. And when you're not open and transparent about it, everyone starts assuming the worst. And if you start saying, oh, everything's going to be fine, this is just like a cold, you'll be fine. You can, which I saw in China Daily, people believe if they eat canned or peaches, that they'll be fine. When that stuff proves to be wrong, the regime, does not, they really don't control things. I was living in Beijing when the Fukushima reactor melted down, and suddenly one afternoon, wave of panic buying of salt. People were convinced that the iodine in ordinary salt would save them from the radiation. Of course, the problem was, and the government came out and said this, if you eat that much salt, it's going to kill you, not because of the radiation, but because of the salt. So I think, we think of Xi Jinping as being very powerful, but China's a country of 1.4 billion people, and to me, it's kind of it's organized chaos, and that the regime tries to ride the chaos, to control the chaos, but it never really does. And so, I think his problem right now is that the shift from COVID zero to post-COVID zero has been so abrupt. It's so disorganized. People are, on the one hand, glad to see the end of COVID, but panicked to see the end of COVID zero. I think he's in a relatively tough position because I really don't think at the end of the day he actually is in control. He controls the leadership, but he doesn't control the unfolding situation.
Okay, thanks, Andy. I'd like to get our other panelists to comment on that particular question. John, could you jump in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I really kind of in radical agreement with Andy. The illusion of control in China, you know, Xi Jinping, we can't stop saying Xi Jinping's the most powerful leader since Mao, but what we really mean is, you know, in the room with the Politburo, right? Although I will have one caveat, which I bring up a little in my paper, but has really come to, I've been thinking a lot about it the last couple of years and written a few things about it. The repressive power of the Chinese state, sorry, let me rephrase that. The repressive dexterity of the Chinese state has grown immensely. So in 1989, when there's a problem in Tiananmen Square, China rolls in tanks. That's literally what Stalin does in Prague in 1968, right? It's the exact same move. There is no difference. 31 years later, nothing has evolved. Now we're another 30 years later after that, and everything is completely different in terms of their capacity. And that's even in the face of the internet, right? They can. Andy is right, of course. If your relatives are dying, if you see bodies piled up on the street, you can't censor that. But they can censor a lot, and they can do it pretty well. And they can also spin things. That's part of it. The other thing is they don't have to send in tanks anymore because the People's Armed Police is a force of 1.5 million people. They are largely focused on riot control. And so you don't have to you don't have to turn your troops and your tanks on your own people to repress even really big street protests, right? And never mind, of course, that again, that internet censorship is going to make that kind of organizing those protests much harder, right? It was one thing in Hong Kong where, you know, it's a very small, very compact city, but across a country like China, organizing protests online in a state that has incredible repressive power is going to be really impressive. But I think the thing that really the kind of the unknown is that we're just seeing in a meaningful way, first time now, is the Chinese state identifying people with facial recognition and with cell phone tracking and sending people text messages. Hey, we know you were at this protest. Don't come again. Stop this, right? They're going to start sending, and those threats are going to be able to escalate, and they're going to be automated, right? I mean, you think you're tired of getting emails from the Warnock campaign. These protesters are going to be receiving emails and text messages and then visits from the police. And so I don't know that that's going to be definitive, but it does add, it adds a couple really impressive new tools to Xi Jinping's arsenal when he goes outside the Politburo and he tries to control the 1.4 billion people in China. It doesn't mean it won't be a challenge, but there are new tools there.
I would just add this. Remember, Mao was so powerful that when he wanted to get rid of the revisionists within the Communist Party, he had to call on the Red Guards and overthrow the Communist Party, and it didn't work.
Right.
You know, I think we exaggerate how powerful Mao really was. He could throw the country into chaos, but he couldn't control the country.
Could I quickly respond to the same question? I think echo what Andy said, that you control the decision making, but there's no way that you can control the fallout. I think the lifting of zero COVID approach is exactly shows how negative impact, you know, the centralization of power is going to have, you know, down the road in all major decisions China is going to make. So before the protest, no one dared to challenge the zero COVID policy. So there is no preparation for this very abrupt and almost unexpected lifting of zero COVID-19. And you see what happened here, right? You know, I just heard from a friend in Beijing, because they're organizing a delegation to visit Atlanta, and I haven't heard back from him for so long. I said, you know, are you still going to come? He said, we're still going to come, but majority of the people who are supposed to come, they already came down with COVID. We're not going to be able to do it. So You see, there's no preparation. There are older people. You have to prepare for the vaccination campaign. There are younger kids. Do you have stockpile of medication for these people? The country was caught so unprepared that you're going to see another wave. But I think this is still better than zero COVID approach. I hope the lesson is going to be learned that you're not going to allow this to happen the second time, the third time, because each time this happens, if it involves such a major decision, then you have to suffer the consequence, which may take years for you to recover. Thanks.
So Yawei, are you saying that, just to go back to John's point, are you saying that these new tools of the state of repression, the text messages to people, the threats and all that kind of thing is likely just not going to work if people are really that upset?
I think so. I mean, they basically remove all those apps from the cell phone like overnight. You imagine how many people are involved in working that. So now it's those people, the so-called 大白, are complaining they have not been paid. And these are the same group that similar to the people who are responsible for family planning, for many decades. They're not going to change the policy because that's the basic policy of the country. You see how China now is suffering from one-child family planning now, the negative growth of the population. So that's why I echo John and Andy. That's why I say you need to learn a lesson from this. You just cannot repeat this, again and again. And then, it's the people that will suffer as a result.
Well, and just to make it a little more complicated, if they are so unprepared that you get this huge wave of infections and death, is the regime's only response COVID-0 2.0? And they go back to the lockdowns because they're unprepared and it's the only response they get. And then what does that do, particularly if, we talk about anti-COVID-0 protests? What if the next wave of protests are demanding a return back to COVID-0? Then, of course, she faces the problem of COVID-0, not COVID-0, and then back to COVID-0 2.2, and he looks pretty weak and indecisive. But what if he has no alternative to going back to the lockdowns, and people are demanding the lockdowns because the vaccines aren't there, the herd immunity isn't there, and people are dropping right and left? So I think, again, getting back to my earlier point is, the kind of near-term outlook, I think, for Xi and the political situation in general is pretty murky, and there's some real downsides that Xi could face.
If I could throw out a question that we have here from the audience, if I could boil down this question, I think that the questioner is asking, how likely would it be that we would get to a situation, a Tiananmen type situation where that kind of brute force is used? What would it take to have that happen?
1 million people in Tiananmen Square sounds like a huge spreader event. Yeah. And I'm not sure that's, I think, thus far, I think the protests have been very small. They've been very isolated. They've been very visible. But, it's impossible to tell what are the Laobaixing thinking. I mean, remember when the protesters left Beida and Renda to Beijing Shifan Dashui to march down to Tiananmen back in April '89, they had no idea what was going to happen. Were they going to walk down to Tiananmen and no one's going to be there? I think that's the kind of context we're in. Yeah, there have been protests, but are they going to spread? Is there going to be a counter protest? I mean, kind of, the reports that I've been seeing out of Beijing, people look like they're panicked and they're staying home. They're not going to Tiananmen Square and locking their doors, and they're self-isolating because they're panicked about a spread of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from from one of our audience members, which is a little bit different angle on this. Essentially, I think what the questioner is asking is, were she and the policymakers just sort of waiting for these protests and hoping that that would happen so that they could change the COVID policy. And they would have justification to do that and say, look, we're listening to the people.
If they were, they certainly weren't prepared. I mean, yeah, there's a logic that says, you know, you put all your ducks in the row, you ramp up production, you're ready with a mass vaccine campaign, you're ready for it. But the way this is unfolded is, it looks like a kind of almost gut response. Is, you know, we got these protests, but you know, I think the underlying logic is not the protests; it's the economy, and it's the fear that the economy is really, it's in the tank. And it's in the tank because of these rolling lockdowns that take a piece out of the supply chain, a piece out of the manufacturing process. And when you take pieces out, when you take Shanghai out for 88 days, your economy does not do well. And so the question is she more worried about the long-term economic consequences than the short-term public health consequences? It is this reaction, okay, well, you demanded this. It's, you know, when the deaths come in, when the infections come in, you blame the protesters, and you don't have to seek them out on AI, you know, artificial intelligence and the surveillance state. You turn public opinion against them and say, well, these people forced us into this hasty and ill-conceived policy. But really, the underlying logic is, well, we really have to just bite the bullet. We have to go through this wave in order to get the economy going. Because if we don't get the economy going in the long term, it's much worse politically than COVID and you know, a second wave of COVID.
Yeah, that's interesting, Andy. And that speaks to this idea that the unstated social contract in China had been, look, we'll accept the limitations, we'll accept authoritarianism in return for a booming economy. And how does Xi Jinping get back to another version of the social contract? Could somebody else maybe jump into that, Yawei or John?
No, I think right now the situation is so fluid. You know, Andy just mentioned, you know, what about, you know, a large number of Chinese citizens are going to demand, you know, a lockdown. Again, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. Again, I think, you know, the leaders, you know, the number one leader and all those other leaders that are surrounding him, they just need to look at, you know, the past 3 years and see how the decision was made, you know, to have zero COVID policy and how that decision was uplifted and what happened in between. And then just to draw lessons, you know, the social contract, you know, I prefer to use mandate of heaven. You know, there's really no sense of a social contract, you know, in the Chinese context. You know, it's whether you're going to have the support or you're not going to have the support. You know, I think I agree with Andy. You know, the economy will have to be developed, and the pie has to be so big that, you know, everyone feels, you know, relatively at ease, and if not happy, that, you know, their life will continue to improve. You know, if that is gone, and you know, you lose the mandate of heaven, and we see in the Chinese history is littered with those things. When emperor loses the mandate of heaven, you know, what's going to happen. I certainly do not want to see a repeat, you know, of sort of the dynastic cycles, you know, that happened in Chinese history for so many thousand years. And I hope, you know, 21st century, if we're still going to try to draw lessons, you know, from the past, that's a very sad and tragic thing.
Yeah, John, do you want to take a shot at commenting on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy is right. I'm really kind of. It's hard for me to see past the economic problem that Xi Jinping is facing down is just so phenomenal, right? I mean, we've had 30-ish years of people saying China's economy can't grow forever, and it defying that, right? Gordon Chang, I've lost count of how many times he's predicted the collapse of China's economy, right? But um, someday it's going to slow down, if not collapse completely. Um, and it's such an important part of their social contract. This is all kind of echoing what's just been said. Um, I don't know what. I mean, this is to me. This is actually why, if I can't fathom why Xi Jinping wanted another term, right? I mean, it seems like he would have been getting off just in time, um, and so by taking that third term, just at a time when China really has a lot of problems to deal with. I think he's set himself up really for an issue, which is why I think despite all the tools he has, despite all the power he has, we should be worried about Taiwan. We should be worried about the kind of behavior that comes when a leader feels backed into a corner, threatened, the way that I think no leader in China has in the past 30, basically since Mao or maybe since Tiananmen. Um, and Andy makes that point that you can't control China. That Mao couldn't control China; he could only create chaos. And Xi Jinping probably ultimately, if push comes to shove, is the same, right? He could do a lot of damage, but can he really control China completely? I don't think so.
Yeah, you mentioned Taiwan, and I wanted to go back to that. I mean, the what everything we're reading about what people in Taiwan are thinking is that people generally are just nonplussed by all of this. They're going about their daily lives, they're going about their business. They don't think that anything bad is going to happen. And how does that factor into what the Taiwan government does, what China does?
I think people in Taiwan, if you look, John in his paper mentioned many of the polls, the majority of the people in Taiwan, they would prefer status quo. They know what will be the consequence, if their leaders suddenly is going to declare independence, if the U.S. is going to go too far, Taiwan actually will be in the jaw of the big shark called the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, they just want to pursue their own happiness. And right now, I think their life is good. I think the Taiwan midterm election also is a reflection, even though it's local, it has probably less to do with the cross-strait situation. But I think the fact that DPP has lost so big, it's also a reflection of people not very happy with their recklessness, publicly welcoming Speaker Nancy Pelosi to visit, publicly saying, we appreciate the support from U.S. lawmakers, from President Trump and from Biden and all of that. I think we have to acknowledge that is a reflection of the voters, who are concerned that the island is going to be engulfed because of this strategic rivalry between U.S. and China. They don't want to be victimized by that process. I think to see peace and the prosperity across the street, the leaders on both sides need to be patient and basically, just like what Deng Xiaoping did before, shelve it and let time run its course. Eventually, people from both sides, ethnic Chinese, they will find a solution. Do not allow the foreigners, the Americans, to use this issue as a wedge to divide and conquer. I think that's the way to go. And that's, I hope that's the normalcy of the things. Right now, it's abnormal. I hope things can return to normalcy quickly.
John, could you take it to correct this? Xi Jinping seems to think that the Taiwan issue really has to be settled soon, sooner rather than later.
I mean, that's. I think that's. I think he's increasingly giving that impression. I think the question is that really true? He has a good incentive to give that impression, right? Because it keeps the pressure on Taiwan. It keeps the issue alive, and it keeps Taiwan scared and concerned about it. But the time is on China's side with Taiwan, right? China's military capacity is increasing. They're trying to get their chip industry up to a place where they can afford to lose a supply of semiconductors from Taiwan. For those not familiar with the issue, basically Taiwan makes around 60% of the world's semiconductors, processor chips for smartphones and computers, and about 90% of the most advanced chips. And there's every reason to believe, and it's a discussion we could have, but there's every reason to believe that if China were to make a serious attempt to invade Taiwan, that one way or another, that supply of chips would dry up. And that would be disastrous for China, but also for the entire world economy. Right? And so time is really on China's side when it comes to Taiwan. So why does he feel this sense of urgency? Well, again, it's either, I think, diversionary, right? He needs to distract, or it's legacy building. He wants to get this in before he leaves. Or maybe there's some sort of, maybe he has a philosophical idea that you know, the longer Taiwan is away, the harder it will sort of be to reunite. But that doesn't strike me as particularly strong reasoning, right? It's not, this isn't like Berlin. This isn't like Germany, East and West, where they were divided by a wall and these cultures kind of grew apart, or even more extreme, you know, North and South Korea. Taiwan and China really still are connected places in terms of, at least before COVID, people traveling back and forth. Before COVID, there were 1 million Taiwanese people in mainland China, and they were watching each other's media for the most part, you know, especially soap operas and music and things. So that doesn't strike me as a particularly credible argument either. So yeah, I guess I would throw it back and say, why does Xi Jinping feel so much urgency about this? Because it seems to me like he shouldn't, like time is on his side. And it really reminds me, not to bring everything back to Mao all the time, because I think that's, you know, dangerous. But you know, Mao, there's those little islands, I think Pengchao is one of them, someone should correct me, just off the coast of Fujian. And whenever Mao sort of wanted the world's attention, he would just shell those islands, right? There's a little bit of that with Taiwan too, which is Taiwan is a great way for China to get the world's attention, to put pressure on the rest of the world whenever it wants to, right? I feel like it's almost more useful as a threat and a point of tension than it is actually invading it. And then I wrote that paper back in the spring saying, why would China really want Taiwan to begin with, right? There's not a lot of actual practical importance for Xi Jinping or China.
Okay, go ahead, Andy.
Follow on with what Yawei said, is that what she is trying to do is to get them back to the kind of typical Chinese fiction of something is but really isn't. So that, you know, what she wants is everyone to go back to the fiction that Taiwan is going to reunify. And as long as everyone says Taiwan at some point in the future will reunify, it doesn't matter that it really isn't. So, you know, when you go to the airport in China, there are two terminals, right? There's a domestic terminal and there's an international Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan terminal. Now, I believe, I could be wrong, but I think Hong Kong and Macau are actually part of the PRC at this point. And Taiwan, they claim to be part of the PRC, but yet they can live with this fiction that, well, that's really not China, but it is China. So, you know, I think for Xi, he needs to get back from this, or to stem off this American desire to, in kind of Confucian terms, rectify the names, which is to say that Taiwan is not just, you know, it is de jure independent, de facto independent. So therefore, it should be de jure independent. And I think from Xi's point of view is, it's fine if it's de facto independent, but God forbid that you ever say it's de jure independence. And as long as you eschew saying that, well, then the status quo is fine. He hasn't lost it, and perhaps he hasn't gained it. But, you know, again, going down in the future, you know, he hasn't suffered a loss, even if he hasn't made a win, but partly because I suspect he knows he cannot win.
Okay, thanks, Andy. I wanted to go back to the chip question and have Andy and John comment on this. Do you think that this chip, the fact that Taiwan is so important as a chip maker, and that the destruction or elimination of the chip making capacity in Taiwan would be devastating for everybody. Is that enough of a reason for Xi Jinping and for the Taiwanese, for that matter, to just sort of put this whole issue aside for a while and not go to the brink?
Yeah.
Andy?
I think it is, and I think they both understand they're in a situation of mutually assured destruction. The last thing Xi Jinping needs in the face of a slowing economy, supply chain problems, bad relationship with the United States is a loss of chips to make iPhones. That just makes everything worse. The same thing for the Taiwanese. Getting into confrontation with the mainland over, this move from de facto to de jure independence. What's the upside? I mean, the upside is keep the fiction going and we'll all make money. And this, as Yawei alluded to, this is a kind of normal Chinese solution to a problem that doesn't have an easy solution, is to basically obfuscate and create illusion and keep going. Because I think, as long as you could keep the relationship at some level of controlled hostility, let's all make money.
Mm-hmm. Yawei, you want to comment on that? And then John?
I've said enough about that, so I'm going to give my time to John.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Andy. It's mutually assured destruction. And I think he made that really good point earlier as well. And he actually, I mean, Yawei made it, I think, first. But as long as this fiction can be maintained, and this is a little bit of an aside, but I find the ways in which the Taiwan fiction is maintained absolutely fascinating, and ultimately pretty successful, and also very varied. One of my favorite things is when Taiwan has an election, it's reported in China as the local election results for a Chinese province, right? This completely defies logic on every level, and yet it's totally, I wouldn't say totally successful, but it's largely successful. The same thing with Taiwan attending the Olympics, right? They attend the Olympics as Chinese Taipei. That doesn't make any sense. It's not a city, right? It's the whole island attending, right? Like people from Tainan are still in the Olympics, but by not calling it Taiwan, and they just call it something else, and everyone seems to be okay with this. And so, I mean, there are still problems. Taiwan's inability to be in like the WHO and had some problems getting vaccines and things. But this as much as it's a fiction and as silly as it seems, it's very, very useful in staving off conflict. And so I think we can expect to see this to continue unless again, I think Xi Jinping's the real variable here, because like we said, with the DPP getting pushed back, and even the DPP is not really pressing for independence anymore. If you actually read what they suggest, we call them the pro-independence party. Their position is pretty nuanced at this point, right? So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but
Yeah, thanks, John. In the time we have left, which isn't, I see the clock, we're coming up on toward the end of our time. I wanted to turn to a couple of questions that we're getting from the chat. And here's one. Panelists have expressed optimism that in the long run, Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait will work out a solution. What happens when a growing majority of people on the island identify themselves as Taiwanese rather than Chinese?
I think it's a good question. The question is, what do you identify yourself as, and what are you willing to pay for that identity? And when I lived in Taiwan, and this goes back 20 years, I mean, all the students I talked to, they all consider themselves Taiwanese. But you ask them, well, are you willing to risk a war with China in order to become independent? And they're like, no, we can be Taiwanese and let the Chinese think we're Chinese, even though we don't think we are. I mean, there is, again, it's this ability to manage two kind of fictions simultaneously.
Well, I think if I can just jump in there, I think also this is one of these places where you don't want to think in English, because if we think in English, that's a distinction. If you think in Chinese, that distinction is not real. It doesn't exist, right? Because like 我是台湾人, I'm Taiwanese, fine, but like 我是华人, I'm China. That's an ethnicity, right? And those are not mutually exclusive at all. In fact, those almost entirely overlap, and you see it really with Hong Kong, right? People in Hong Kong. no hai Hong Kong yan, right? I'm Hong Kongese, but you ask a Hong Kong person, even one that strongly identifies, like Hong Kong, you know, like, yeah, they're Huaren, right? So I think we need to be a little careful about like what you know, is it your nationality, is your ethnicity, is it your civilization, is it history? How are these things different and connected? I don't think there's kind of just like the one identity, right? So I think that adds a lot of nuance to it. I don't think it necessarily clears things up. It probably muddies it, but I do think you need to keep that in mind.
Okay, thanks. I want to switch gears here. We got another question from the chat, which will take us in another direction. Regarding the deterioration of the relationship between China and the U.S., what will happen concerning technology and trade between the two countries and U.S.-China relations in the longer term? I mean, we discussed some of that, but somebody want to take a shot at answering that?
Yeah, I think as far as the U.S. government, Congress are concerned, you know, their fear is that China is going to be a military juggernaut, that we have to deny China that opportunity. So as far as chips are concerned, as far as other dual use technology are concerned, I think the Chinese leaders should come to realize that, you know, that decoupling is happening and probably will be deepening. But both sides can still sell their things to the other side. You know, they're perfect, harmless. You know, Chinese like to drink Coca-Cola, they like to eat pizza, and, you know, Americans like to enjoy, you know, all the commodities that they purchase from Amazon to, you know, give as gifts to their families and the relatives. I think that part should continue. As Andy said, both sides should realize that their top priority is to make money together and let the leaders worry about these security issues. And both sides, I think, need to change their perception of the other side. And particularly, I would emphasize the Americans. You know, many of them are paranoid. Many of them are possessed by the fear that China is out there to undermine everything the U.S. represent for. You know, China does not have the capability to do that. China probably doesn't have the intention to do that. And you know, sometimes we should take what the Chinese leaders say literally. And what they say literally is by 2050, they want Chinese people to have a modernized country, they have a better and happier life. You know, that's their goal. I think we can still take that at its face value and literally. And China doesn't have a plan to substitute the U.S. You know, in the Western Pacific and East Asia. China doesn't have a plan to undermine the American political system. China doesn't have that wherewithal to do any of that.
I think also you have to come down to the basic reality is China's not going away. You're not going to just get rid of China. So the question is, how can you peacefully coexist with China? Yeah, sure. I mean, there are those who want China to change, but that dynamic is a long-term dynamic, and it's one that probably the U.S. and a kind of doesn't really have that much ability to bring about in the near term. And so the alternative is, well, what are you going to do? You know, where does strategic confrontation end up? I mean, do you really think, you know, as some do in Congress, that you're going to overthrow the Communist Party and install small d Democrats, or I suppose small d Republicans, in anywhere the near term? It's just completely unrealistic. Xi's got his domestic problems. He's got a slowing economy. He's got the COVID mess. But, you know, the fall of the Soviet Union, it didn't work out that well for us. I mean, that's why, you know, we're sending billions of dollars in weaponry to support the Ukrainians. So, in some ways, you gotta be careful that, you don't always want to get what you wish for. And so the question is, what are you wishing for if you're on Capitol Hill?
John, do you
Yeah.
want to?
Yeah, Andy, you stole my mic drop moment about the Soviet Union. I wanted to make that. I literally just written that down. But so excellent point. But yeah, I think that Yahweh's general point about the paranoia of a lot of people in the U.S. and just their lack of realism about what's going to happen. Right? I mean, China is not trying to overthrow the U.S. government. They don't. They're not trying to undermine democracy around the world. Particularly, they're certainly out for their own interests. But this paranoia also carries over to anytime China engages any other country abroad, it becomes this sort of these people. We're suddenly there's a lot of scholars too are on this quest to find anything bad that China has done abroad. And they don't necessarily behave particularly well, but a lot of democracies don't behave particularly well abroad too. So this debt diplomacy has been really overblown, is my understanding. And and the whole thing is, I mean, this is maybe not that original a point, but the whole thing is such a self-fulfilling cycle. If we only see China in terms of conflict, we are going to have conflict, and China is not going away. And if it did go away, it would be a disaster. Right? We don't want China to go away. And it would be a disaster in the way that Andy, it'd be possible there's the consequences that Andy already alluded to with the Soviet Union, right? If China falls apart, or the Soviet Union, we defeated the Soviet Union, right? And then look what we've got. But even if that happens with China, we didn't depend on the Soviet Union for our economy, right? They were an important part of the global economy the United States was part of. So now we have two huge reasons not to want China to fall apart, right? So what does defeating China mean? So coexisting with China, it's not an option, right? People are asking, is it possible to coexist with China? The only alternative, it's coexist or war, right? And so unless you're seriously suggesting we wipe a sixth of the human population off the map with nuclear weapons, there's not an alternative.
Yeah. And that relates to, I think, the last question. We're a little bit over time, so I want to ask one last question, which kind of incorporates a number of questions that people in the audience have raised. And I apologize for not reading the questions literally, but I think I'm summarizing it. And I wanted to sort of take the temperature of the panel. I gather all of you are saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the U.S. essentially is overreacting to the idea that to the rise of China, and overreacting and seeing China as a threat. Is that pretty much am I paraphrasing what you're thinking correctly? Yawei, can we start with you?
I think so, but we have to also highlight the fact that the relationship, as Jim, you mentioned earlier, hitting the bottom. It's not just the responsibility of the Americans or the U.S. government. The Chinese leaders, what the Chinese government has done, are also partially responsible. So it takes two to tango, and it takes two sides to figure out what are the problems that can be addressed, and what are the problems that cannot easily be addressed, and what are the problems that probably can never address, and then just put them away, so that the guardrail that President Biden emphasized so much, that what are the guardrails, and put them in place so that these two nuclear powers are not going to confront each other.
Okay. Andy?
Yeah, I would totally agree with Yahweh. I mean, it would be naive not to react to the rise of China. The rise of China in the past 10 years has been very rapid. It has moved from really being a kind of second-rate power to it is going to become a superpower. And you don't want to downplay the problems in the relationship. But it's like any relationship that we can't get divorced. We can't move to the other side of the world and ignore each other. And so we've got a relationship. It is fraught with problems. And the only way to really deal with that effectively is to sit down and figure out what is the core? What is the core that we have to learn to cooperate with so that we're not throwing the dishes at each other? And that occasionally we can lob a teacup at them over Xinjiang or Tibet or human rights and so on and so forth, without making that the kind of end all and be all that we're going to go down with the ship on this issue, because we can't go down with the ship. We have to figure out how to coexist with each other. That doesn't mean we're going to love each other. It doesn't mean the Chinese are going to become like Americans or the Americans are going to become like Chinese. Tensions will remain, but we got to manage those tensions. I think the problem is that the past 10 years, we've done a lousy job trying to manage things, in large part because I think Americans, particularly on Capitol Hill, have been caught off guard that all of the predictions of what the Chinese used to call peaceful evolution didn't pan out. That China is not evolving toward a liberal democracy. It's evolving toward a Chinese kind of politics. And I think we've had a very hard time accepting that the Communist Party didn't adopt economic reforms to turn China into a democracy. They adopted economic reforms to stabilize and consolidate socialism in China. So we have to understand what each other are doing, and to accept that, well, maybe there's nothing we can do about that. We have to come out with some way of not destroying each other in the process.
Thanks, Andy. John, last but not least, you have the last word.
Oh, thank you. Well, first I want to go off Andy's point about the economic reforms. And this was like, we were so unrealistic. China always said these are economic reforms. We're not becoming a democracy, right? But like, you could cover the island of Taiwan in articles and papers and books from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s about how China was going to become a liberal democracy, or at least some version of that, right? So I think, and this is, I think this is where I think U.S. views of China are much less kind of realistic and nuanced than a lot of Chinese views of the U.S. They basically, China understands the United States much better than we understand China, and it's no surprise. How many students from China come to study in the United States, right? It's an order of magnitude more than we send to China. It's really sad how little study abroad there is from American schools to China. How many people in China study English, right, or consume American media? The numbers are staggering. The reverse is almost non-existent. We have just completely downplayed. We like to see China as a threat, but we don't want to do anything about it. And I wrote an article for China Currents earlier in the year about this, but if we want to get along with China, which I totally agree with what Yawei and Andy are saying, we have to. And I also, Andy, I think you would be I think you have a second career as a marriage counselor if you want it. If we want to get
I'm
along,
done with careers.
Okay. Well, maybe I get bored. If we want to get along with China, and the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter if we want to, we have to get along with China. And so we have to pay more attention and actually try to learn things about China, and to think about China in intelligent ways. And if we do that, we'll find that we have much more to gain by cooperating with China than we have to lose. Because really, we're not diametrically opposed in the way we were with the Soviets. The Soviets had a different way of understanding the world and the way it should work, and China fundamentally doesn't. I mean, our entire economy and globalization, the way it exists today, is fundamentally because the United States and the European Union and China and a number of other countries are able to get along on kind of the basics of how the world should work. Right. And when we blow up the threats and the problems and the disagreements, it makes it look like we can't coexist. And that's just not true, because we have been coexisting and it's been very mutually beneficial. So I would leave it on that semi-optimistic note that if we can pull ourselves out of this death spiral, or I should say more like conflict spiral, there's certainly ways to prevent this and to have at least as Andy suggests, a moderately successful marriage until the kids go to college.
You know,
There you go.
it's always good to end on an optimistic note and talk about kids going to college. So we're all for that. So I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Andy Wedeman, Dr. Yawei Liu, and Dr. John Givens. This has been a fascinating discussion. I hope we'll have more of these. And I just want to say thank you again.